Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. I want to let everyone get into the webinar first. We'll get started in just about a minute and a half. It's still a minute before 7. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. I'm Marnie Smith from the Burlington Public Library. Thank you for joining us tonight, and welcome to the 4th program of our 5-part monthly art series with Jane Oneail. On the first Thursday of each month from now until March, Jane will explore an art topic. Tonight's program is titled Made for Each Other, Famous Couples in the World of Art. Next month, on March 3rd, Jane's program is titled Georgia O'Keeffe, Beyond the Blossoms. Georgia O'Keeffe is best known for her revolutionary floral still lifes, but she explored a variety of subjects, including the skyscrapers of New York City and deserts of New Mexico during her long career. This series is a collaboration of the Burlington Public Library, Tewksbury Public Library, and Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover. I would like to thank the Friends Group of each of these 3 libraries for generously supporting this series. Now I'd like to welcome Jane Oneail. Jane is the owner and creator of Culturally Curious, an arts education firm that curates and delivers engaging art talks to audiences throughout New England. She's an independent scholar and holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in art in education from Harvard University. Jane is a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, in the Courier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. If you have a question, type it in the chat and Jane will answer it at the end of the program. We are recording tonight, and I expect to have a link on the Burlington Public website to the lecture on Monday of next week. And at the end, we're going to have to ask Jane to describe the upcoming program that's going to be next month. So Jane, thank you so much for coming.
It's such a pleasure, Marnie. Thank you for having me back. I'm happy to say that there's actually a little bit of a preview of the Georgia O'Keeffe program in this program tonight, because she is a part of one of the couples we'll be looking at. So we'll get a sneak peek at that. And so thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about this topic and all of the artists that we'll be exploring. This is a great topic for the month of February as we think about Valentine's Day. So maybe you're watching with someone you love. Maybe you're just going to write down a few good facts to impress someone that you're interested in. But hopefully, you'll enjoy this no matter if you're watching it for yourself or as part of a duo. So tonight, we're going to be looking at love. We're going to be looking at lust, passion. There's even going to be some danger in here, and maybe even at least one true harmonious relationship. But when it comes to making art, we have this very romantic notion around art making. And I think we oftentimes think of like artists falling in love with their models and their muses, that there's something about the intensity of the observation and that time together that can stir up these feelings of passion. So why shouldn't that extend to the person that you might be sharing your studio with? This is a picture of the Pygmalion myth painted by the French artist Gérôme in 1890. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's just the little spark to get our minds going about, you know, all of the passion that can be unleashed in the studio. So we have a lot to cover tonight, a number of couples to look at. And just to give you a sense in terms of who they are, we'll be looking at Judith Leyster and Jan Molenaer. They're from the Dutch Baroque, so the 1600s. We'll fast forward to the 1900s and look at Camille Claudel and Auguste Rodin, French sculptors. And then the rest of our artists are from the 20th century: Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, Anna Mendieta and Carl Andre. And we'll wrap up, no pun intended, with Jean-Claude and Christo, who you will find out, if you don't already know, really like to wrap things. Because there's so much to cover here, the main focus will be on how their relationship is reflected in their artwork, or what we can divide about their relationship from their artwork. So there's a lot you could say about all of these artists, their interest in politics or religion. That's not for tonight. Tonight is about the love, the lust, the passion. All right, so let's turn our attention to the Dutch Baroque and Judith Leyster and Jan Molenaer. Now, this is a period of art that I particularly love because of the smiling. And we will get back to this image in just a moment. But these are two images by leading artists from this period. This is not Molenaer or Leyster in this case. These are both by the artist Frans Hals, who is generally known as like the great master of this time period. But I wanted to start with these images because in them both, you see people looking out directly at you, smiling. And generally speaking, in the history of art, you don't see this that often. People had bad teeth. They didn't really want them memorialized. But there's a joyfulness in a lot of these scenes, which I just find so appealing. And there's a sweetness, really, too, to the way these children are painted with their bright pink cheeks. So just to get us oriented in space and time, when we're talking about the Dutch Baroque, we're talking about a period with a thriving economy. There's robust trade, and people in the middle class can afford to buy pictures. So they want sort of happy scenes, like the ones that we're looking at here. So let me introduce you to the artist couple for this section. We have Judith Leyster in a self-portrait over here, and then Jan Molenaer in a self-portrait that was painted about a decade later in 1640. It goes, probably it's very worth mentioning that Judith Leyster, as a woman who was a professional artist, is really an exception to the rule, particularly in this period of art. And so this self-portrait of hers is particularly wonderful. She's giving us such a great sense in terms of who she is, how she works even. And there's that wonderful informality and warmth to this particular self-portrait. I love that she's painted herself in the process of painting the kind of work that would have been very popular and so much in demand. So it's like she's sharing her success with us. And then we have her husband over here, who's kind of playing dress up. There's a lot of artists that did this type of thing, including Rembrandt, who was a contemporary. They would sort of dress up in fantastic clothes and make these exaggerated expressions. So this couple was married in 1636. She was 27, he was 26, and they shared a studio. But most of her paintings actually predate their marriage. Molenaer, the husband here, is much more prolific. It turns out, though, that she was probably more highly regarded by most of their contemporaries. But after she died, she was basically forgotten, and we'll look a little bit at as to why that might have happened. So first of all, they shared a studio and they had very similar subjects when they were painting, and it's sometimes almost impossible to distinguish who painted which image. There's a lot of merry music makers in their repertoire. In this case, Molenaer is on the left, and that's a work that's at the National Gallery in London. So they both liked small groups. They both liked these smiling faces and these cherubic looking children, and images where people were kind of engaging with us, the viewer. Here's another great example of their work. We have Judith Leyster's painting over here called A Game of Cards, and then Molenaer's painting called The Card Players over here. These were painted within 3 years of each other in the 1630s. This work over on the right is actually in New Hampshire at the Currier Museum of Art in Manchester. So it's a wonderful work to see in person. Both of these are delightful images where we have a very sort of large, prominent, seated figure who we see is kind of engaged in a card game where somebody is cheating. And these paintings are always so much fun to kind of decode who's cheating, who's winning, who's being made the fool, essentially. But you can see here, Molenaer's picture has so much more detail when it comes to the costume and you know, the ornamentation of what is still a very simple space. Now, this is a very popular motif in this time period. Here's just another major artist from the time, Jan Steen, who painted a very similar concept, the card players. This is from 1660. So for decades, basically, these artists are kind of cranking out these similar pictures about cheating at cards. Who knew that that could be such a popular subject? But like I said, Jan Molenaer, the husband in this particular pairing, became much more prolific. Essentially, after he gets married to Judith Leyster, she has 5 children, and she essentially stops painting. So his compositions, well, they've survived, they've withstood the test of time, and you can see that they get pretty complex and really wonderfully detailed. I mean, we could spend all night just looking at this one composition. I mean, look at the details of the clothing here, the ribbons at the knees and on the shoes, the ruffles in the dress over here, and then even ancestors included in this particular family grouping, going back generations. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture. Every now and then, we know that Judith Leyster would pick up her paintbrushes again, but she was doing very small compositions. I mean, you can imagine if you have 5 children, when can you devote time to painting? And of course, because she's Dutch, she had to paint a few tulips here and there. This is from 1643. So there's only a few of her paintings really that come after the time that she had children. But this one in particular, another self-portrait, was only recently discovered. This was painted in 1653. It's much smaller than the original self-portrait that we saw. It's painted on panel, and it was most likely something that she painted for her family. Now, believe it or not, this was hung in a British country house for centuries, and nobody knew who it was or what this picture was about. And when it was discovered in 2017, it was sold at auction, and it went for about $600,000. So Judith Leyster's star is certainly on the rise these days. So her husband, following Judith Leyster's death, just a few years later, he is essentially making paintings to pay off creditors. So this is a picture that he created called Peasants Carousing from 1662. It's so dense, it's so complicated. It's all about the bad behavior of the lower class. And believe it or not, upper class patrons loved to buy these pictures to, reinforce the morals that they held so dear. But this image in particular was necessary because Jan Molenaer's life had changed. He no longer had his wife. He no longer had that support in place. So, like I said, Judith Leyster's star is on the rise, and we have a new appreciation in terms of her contributions to the art world because, for one, we know her signature a little bit better, and you can probably just make it out over here in the Jolly Topper. She does the L from her name, and then she connects it to star, so Leyster here. Incredibly, over the years, forgers have essentially painted out her signature and painted in the signature of Franz Hall and even her husband's signature to try and pass off her work. But these days, her work is probably more interesting and more valuable to a lot of collectors and museums. So if we're sort of weighing whose reputation has won, I think there's this renewed interest in this successful young woman who was working as an artist in the 1600s. So maybe Judith Leyster kind of wins in this dynamic, if you would say somebody from a couple was winning. The next couple we're going to be looking at, fast forward to the 1900s, the late 1900s, is it's sort of a torrid love affair. In this case, we're looking at Camille Claudel and Auguste Rodin, and you're probably familiar with at least their works. Here we're looking at an image of young Camille Claudel. She was about 19 years old when she began to work in the studio of the nationally renowned sculptor Auguste Rodin, and he was about 24 years older than her. This is a portrait of him painted by John Singer Sargent when he was about 44 years old. So he was established, he was successful. She joined his workshop as an assistant and then quickly became a confidant, a model, and his lover. And so they were together for over a period of about 10 years. And it was a torrid love affair because he essentially had a common law wife at this time, a woman by the name of Rose Buret. That was about a 20-year-old relationship. So suffice it to say, Camille Claudel's family was not pleased with this relationship. But for Claudel and Rodin, they were inspired by each other. They made portraits of each other. So in this case, this is Rodin's portrait of Claudel and Claudel's portrait of Rodin. And they actually had very similar styles. And during this time period, and even today, when artists have assistants, the assistants oftentimes play a huge role in the production of works of art. So in a major composition like this one, this is almost 20-foot high doors called The Gates of Hell, that incidentally Rodin took 37 years to work on, and it has 180 figures in it. So almost certainly Camille Claudel played a big role in fashioning these figures. And this is just a detail over here of some of those figures at the top. We can see how densely packed some of them are. All right, so in some cases, Camille Claudel's work actually inspired Rodin's work. So we have two cases of seated girls in this case, and Camille Claudel's sculpture predates Rodin's over here. So there's influence going both ways, but the status is really all referred to Rodin. Excuse me for just a moment. I'm going to put myself on mute because I have a little coughing fit coming on. I'm just going to grab a drink. All right, I apologize for that. Ooh, a little tickle in my throat. All right, so the influence goes both ways, but all of this status is conferred to Rodin. Now, one of Rodin's most famous works is The Kiss. You've probably seen it before, term 1882, and it's a depiction of this passionate embrace. It's a scene from, well, it's characters from Dante's Divine Comedy, two lovers that were slain after the woman's husband discovered them, and they were condemned to wander in hell for eternity. So a year after Rodin exhibited The Kiss, Camille Claudel started this work over here, which is called The Waltz. And by the time she finished it, this relationship that the two artists had was really kind of on the skids. And so we have this kind of weighty earthbound sculpture over here by Rodin, and then something that seems a little bit more ethereal, lighter, and much more poignant, certainly too, if we think of the artists splitting up at this time. So Camille Claudel moves to England shortly, and for a short time, and she certainly misses Rodin. He is passionate about her. He misses her, and he convinces her to come back to him based on a contract which said he wouldn't have any other students. They would have this kind of exclusive relationship. So this sculpture by Claudel seems to capture this moment in their relationship, and the sculpture itself is also an illustration from a Sanskrit poem, but it's it's generally known as The Abandonment. It's was begun in 1886, and it's about two lovers, and the man decides he cannot marry this woman, and so he leaves her, and this is the moment he comes back to her with all this regret, and so she's sort of collapsing into his arms as he's begging for this forgiveness. Now, the relationship remains really tumultuous, and Claudel becomes sort of increasingly paranoid. And so this sculpture that she creates, which is called The Age of Maturity, is oftentimes interpreted to be a portrait of their relationship. If you didn't know the backstory, you could easily interpret this as a man who's leaving youth and entering into old age. But we've seen Camille Claudel's caricatures of Rodin's common law wife, Rose, and we know that this older figure who is pulling at and sort of guiding the standing male figure is in fact his common law wife. And so this could be understood to be Camille Claudel on her knees, just losing her grasp on her lover, her mentor, the man who was essentially everything to her. So she began to resent the kind of power that he had in her life. She began to push away from him. Like I said, she became a little bit paranoid. She thought he was working against her behind her back, when in actuality, he was subsidizing her income and planning for an entire exhibition space at his plan for his museum. So here we're looking at two different views of Camille Claudel's sculpture of essentially Perseus and Medusa. So Perseus here has beheaded Medusa. He holds her head up above him, and we can see her body down below. So the enchantress here has been slain, and we have a sort of evil villain in this case who has done it, even though he's generally thought of as the hero. So this can be kind of like the final statement from Claudel in terms of what that relationship might have looked like. Now, her story ends in tragedy. A few years after she cuts things off with Rodin, her father dies suddenly, and her family commits her to an asylum, and she spends the next 30 years of her life there. She was committed just before she turned 50. Rodin died just a few years into her commitment, and essentially her family disowned her. They stopped talking to her. So it was a really sort of tragic end for this woman who seems to almost have been driven mad by the nature of this torrid love affair that they had. Now, who wins out in terms of their reputations today, I think Rodin looms large. Everybody on the planet has seen the thinker in either in person or in reproduction. It's one of the most iconic sculptures ever made. But once again, people are really interested in female artists and in the passion, right? So there's multiple films made about Camille Claudel and their relationship. And now there is a museum dedicated to her works too. During a particularly bad episode that she had before being committed, she did destroy many of her statues, but I believe there's about 90 remaining works that are on display at the museum. So it's a couple that you sort of would like to get to know a little bit better, because there's something really kind of salacious about the nature of their connection. Now, let's turn our attention to our next couple. And Georgia O'Keeffe, I'm sure, is a name that you've heard before. This is a woman who certainly outshines her husband in terms of the legacy. And we have our quote here about the flower, because whenever you're talking about Georgia O'Keeffe, it always comes back to the flower paintings. We're going to hardly touch on them tonight. I want to first introduce you to Alfred Stieglitz. Here we see him in a photograph by Gertrude Kesbier. He was essentially the most important person in the early 20th century in terms of introducing America to modernism. He helped to guide the careers of painters and of photographers, and he was particularly committed to the idea of making photography an art form, which is kind of revolutionary when you think about it. I mean, most people would think it's a document, but he was a photographer himself. This is perhaps one of his most famous photographs over here, called The Steerage, where you can see not just the documentary nature of it, where we have kind of upper class passengers on a steamship and the lower class down below, but you can then kind of almost blur your eyes and see the artful nature of it too. You know, the circle created by the hat up above, the X in the white suspenders over here. So he wanted us to really appreciate the formal qualities of photography in the same way that you would with a painting. So where does Georgia O'Keeffe come into this? Well, here we're looking at a few of her early paintings and drawings. She was a young woman. She was about 23 years younger than Alfred Stieglitz, and he owned a gallery in New York City. She was working as a school teacher in Texas, and they began a relationship of letters, essentially. But the relationship got very intense. I mean, she would write to him about, you know, I'm telling you things that I've never told anybody. And so after this bond grows, she shows up one day unannounced at his gallery, and from there this relationship grows, and he helps to catapult her and her art and her reputation through some rather racy photographs of her. These are the tame ones, but there's plenty of nudes. He's known for photographing her hands, and she was beautiful. And these photographs helped to draw a lot of attention to Georgia O'Keeffe as an artist. Incidentally, of course, he's also the person that said that her flower paintings were about more than just flowers, gave it the sexual reading as well. So you can, from this point on, he ends up divorcing his wife, who he had said that he had a loveless relationship with, and the two artists commit themselves to a life together. And you can see from their artwork that that their ideas are sort of in dialogue with each other, even though they're working in different media. Here we have O'Keeffe's painting Blue and Green Music from 1921. And then on the right, we have Songs of the Sky in 5 pictures from 1923. This is Stieglitz over here. So there's this kind of interest in these cloud-like formations. There is something sort of suggestive of flowers over here, but we get the same sort of rippling movement in both of these. And it's interesting that they've named them both after music too. So the two artists settle in New York City. I absolutely adore Georgia O'Keeffe's skyscraper paintings, these various views of the city from their 13th floor apartment. And she begins to want a child, and that's something that he is not really interested in. So she kind of falls into a little bit of a depression, realizing that motherhood was going to be incompatible with making her art. So she, after a few years, she begins to start spending at least part of the year, or the larger part of the year, in Taos, New Mexico, and she's inspired by the landscape, by the cultures, by the visual information around her, and it really transforms her artwork. So this is an example of one of her paintings from New Mexico called the Ram's Head with White Hollyhock Hills. It's striking, it's haunting, right? It doesn't look like those modern compositions that she was making when he was with her. But Stieglitz was devastated that she wasn't there. And these two would write each other letter after letter after letter. If they were alive today, they would be the type of couple that, is constantly texting each other, that are, distracted from everything else in life by their connection to each other. That being said, she wasn't there. and there was another beautiful young woman in Stieglitz's life, a woman by the name of Dorothy Norman, and he started a relationship with her. We see her over here on the left. And here we have another example of one of Georgia O'Keeffe's Southwestern paintings over here. This is Pelvis 2 from 1944. The relationship between Dorothy Norman and Alfred Stieglitz sent Georgia O'Keeffe into a depression. In fact, she had to be hospitalized. So they continued to write letters, and Georgia O'Keeffe had this sort of burning and kind of growing resentment towards her husband. He had a lot of control over her career. He was dictating sort of where her work could be exhibited. I think he influenced who was buying it. And so she really began to resent that. And so it did cause a fracture between them. Now, in 1946, Stieglitz suffered a heart attack, and Georgia O'Keeffe was still in New Mexico, and she dropped everything and immediately returned and kind of took over everything, pushed that Dorothy Norman right out the door. The day after he died, she took complete control over his gallery and his entire body of work. And he had, I think, 2,500 objects to his credit. She immediately gave 1,300 of those objects to the National Gallery of Art, and in doing so, essentially cemented his reputation as a leading photographer, as someone of great importance in the 20th century. So she ensured his reputation for years to come. But of course, it's Georgia O'Keeffe that everybody knows. And so even today, 8 out of the 9 highest prices ever paid for a Stieglitz photograph were all images of Georgia O'Keeffe. So here we've got another image, this time just focusing on her neck and her collarbones. I think the highest price ever fetched for one of these photographs was somewhere in the area of $1.5 million. Over here on the right, we have a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. Now this was, I believe, the most expensive work by Georgia O'Keeffe that was ever sold, $73 million. So certainly her reputation far exceeds her husband's. She died at the age of 98, and she lived up until 1986, so for several decades after her husband's death. And so we can see that her star in terms of her artistic career continued to soar long after his death, but he certainly helped to jumpstart things for her. All right, our next artistic couple is one that I feel like is really kind of popular in popular culture these days, really. It's Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. And this is an intensely passionate relationship. Don't marry someone you can live with. You have to marry someone you can't live without. And this really sort of defines the nature of this union. So this is interesting. It's another kind of common thread with a lot of these artists. There's a huge age difference between Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, about 20 years, and he was her senior. He had two common law wives when he met her, and they got married right around the time that she was 21 in the late 1920s. And her parents really opposed this marriage, even though she was marrying a world famous artist. They refer to it as the elephant marrying the dove. And you can see, certainly visually, they look like opposites. As artists, they were real opposites too. He was a muralist. He was painting on a grand scale, massive scale, really. This is an example of one of his murals over here on the right. And we can see that this is a physical process. You're up and down scaffolding, you're standing, you're stretching. And these were works, these were massive commissions that told, the histories of countries. And compare that to the work of his wife. Frida Kahlo was oftentimes confined to a bed because of the physical pain that she experienced through most of her life. When she was just 18 years old, she was in a horrible trolley and bus accident where she was where she had multiple bones broken, and she was impaled through her uterus with one of the handrails from the trolley. So she went through, I think, 24 surgeries over the course of the next few decades, and her paintings show this really kind of intimate and painful response to what she was feeling. So the painting over here on the right is called The Broken Column, where she shows her spine as a broken classical column here. There are pins and nails sticking out of her skin. Her whole body is being held together by this brace. And even though her face is stoic, she has tears just streaming down her face. So with these paintings, we see this psychological intimacy that is very, very rare in the history of art. Some people liken it to Vincent van Gogh, but even Van Gogh wasn't sobbing in his paintings. So shortly after the couple is married, I apologize for the quality of this particular image, but shortly after the couple is married, Frida Kahlo paints this picture of the two of them as a gift for a friend. And I think it's really interesting that she paints her husband as the artist here, and she paints herself as like the dutiful and traditional wife. Even though she's done the painting, she doesn't show herself with paintbrushes. And so a lot of their lives, at least initially when they were married, was traveling for these massive commissions that Diego Rivera was getting, including a commission to paint this enormous space at the Detroit Institute of Art in Michigan. And because it's Detroit, it's a mural about the history of the auto industry. So it was a massive undertaking. It took 9 months of intensive work, and 27 paintings in all were completed. This was in 1932. And while they were both in Detroit, here's just another view of the same mural, incredibly complicated and just really powerful. But while they were there, Frida Kahlo found out that she was pregnant. And I sort of have to warn you for this next image that we're going to see, because unfortunately, she also lost the pregnancy while they were in Detroit. And she created this heart-wrenching image of what it was like to lose this pregnancy while she was at the Henry Ford Hospital. So here she is lying naked on a hospital bed with this red ribbon connecting her really to these disparate objects: a baby, a broken pelvis bone, her pelvis bone, the flower, which is suggestive of her anatomy, the snail suggesting just how slow this entire process was. And all of this is set on this desolate landscape with the Detroit auto industry suggested in the background. So, so her pain certainly manifesting in these really sort of private compositions that she created in response to this horrible, horrible tragedy in her life. And as it turns out, that tragedy impacted Diego Rivera and his massive mural as well. So on one wall here, we can see that he painted this sort of suggestion of a seed, the start of life, the start of industry and agriculture. And if we zoom in here, that seed was transformed into this perfect infant during the course of his painting, and probably, no doubt, in response to the loss of his child. So, so there's a lot of tumult in Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo's relationship. They get divorced, they get remarried. There's multiple affairs. Diego Rivera even has an affair with Frida Kahlo's sister. But in the end, they do reunite. And I should mention here that we are looking at their home that they lived in from 1934 to 1939. You can see they essentially had separate houses that were connected. They both had studios and homes here, and they could kind of mingle with each other, but they also kept a respectful distance so that they could both kind of continue on with the freedom that they enjoyed. So after they were remarried, though, the nature of the relationship sort of changes, and the intensity of Frida's passion for Diego, I think, is even more heightened. This is a portrait that she created of the two of them for their wedding anniversary, where she has she's literally combined their heads into one head. That's probably going well beyond what you've done for any recent anniversary celebration. Maybe a nice picture together, but you probably don't suggest in any way that you're one being. Over here on the right, we can see a depiction of Frida Kahlo. She's surrounded by like these greater kind of mythological elements here, but we can also see her holding Diego Rivera as though he is like an infant, a naked baby in her arms, which is once again just heartbreaking, knowing that she lost actually more than one of his children over the course of her life. So even towards the end of her life, she paints these pictures that very clearly tell us Diego is on her mind. Here she has taken down her traditional updo, the sort of tight updo, and it almost looks like her hair is choking her. Now it's not her body that's causing the pain, it's really Diego. So if we think about their legacy and sort of who has withstood the test of time, well, certainly Frida Kahlo has captured the popular imagination. There's the popular Frida movie starring Selma Hayek. Frida Kahlo's family has licensed her likeness for every product imaginable, from shoes to tequila to nail polish, and she was featured in a Disney movie, Coco, not too long ago, too. So she is very much a part of our popular imagination. And I can't really say the same for Diego Rivera, although certainly he is still so well respected and highly regarded. Now, the next couple that we're going to turn our attention to is probably our most scandalous out of all of them tonight, and maybe the pair that you know the least. So we're looking at Anna Mendieta and Carl Andre. Now, we're moving into the 1980s at this point. Anna Mendieta was a young artist who was working primarily in the earth art movement. I'm doing a program on earth art in April, so you'll have the chance to get to know her a little bit better. But Carl Andre was 13 years older than her, and he was working as a minimalist sculptor. And by the time they had met, he had already had a solo exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum at the age of 35. So he was doing incredibly well. So the couple dates for a few years, and then they get married in 1985. Now, just to give you a sense in terms of Carl Carl Andre's work and what it means to be a minimalist sculptor. Well, this is minimalism for you. It's oftentimes letting the material of the object speak for itself. It's creating non-representational works here, and there's a real simplicity to this work, to say the least. This is, oh, sorry, I'm getting another tickle in my throat. Just a moment. Sorry about that. Ooh. All right, so here is one of Carl Andre's probably best known works, called Equivalence 8 from 1966. And this work has been called the most boring controversy in the history of art. Essentially, what we're looking at is just a pile of bricks. And the Tate Modern paid $12,000 for it. I'm so sorry. I got just another cough. All right. So sorry. Getting back to Carl Andre. So you can imagine, people did not love the idea of a museum spending that much money on a simple pile of bricks. It seemed really silly. And so there was a little bit of an outrage in response to this. But once again, it's so simple that that people were sort of too bored by it to even have outrage over it. Now, all of this is so different from the work that Anna Mendieta was doing. Before she really delves into earth art, she is kind of exploring her own identity through photography and costumes and makeup like this. I should mention that she was Cuban born and she fled the country. And so there's this kind of notion of like a person without a home in a lot of her works here. So she's trying to find home in some of these pictures, particularly once she gets into exploring the relationship between nature and her body. Now, as a very brief introduction to earth art, I have Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty over here on the right, or sorry, on the left. And that was created in 1970 in the Great Salt Lake. Now, this was a massive undertaking, like a work that required the movement of earth. Anna Mendieta's work in terms of earth art is really different. It's really all about her body and the nature of her relationship with the earth in a given photograph. It's all on a human scale. So we see this photograph of her nude body with it looks almost as though it's in a grave-like setting with flowers sprouting from it. And so we can see that this using her body becomes this common motif. Sometimes there's fire, sometimes there's ice, oftentimes, well, there's a lot of blood, and she was known to use chicken blood to create that effect in a lot of her work. So sometimes it's the absence of her body, it's the contours, it's the silhouette, and it prompts us as the visitor or as the viewer to ponder this relationship between the self and the earth, the very nature that she is showing here. So we have just a few more examples of some of her work, some of her practice over here. Now, I don't think you can really make a great case that Carl Andre's work and Ana Mendietta's work were really in dialogue with each other. The closest comparison I can draw here is that maybe his Equivalence 8, that boring work of art, is kind of on a human scale. It could be sort of like a suggestion of a body lying on the ground, and certainly that's probably what Ana Mendietta was best known for. So let's turn our attention to how tumultuous the artists' relationships were. So over here, we are looking at the news report of Ana Mendietta's death. Now, she fell from the 34th floor of their apartment building, and it was widely assumed that that her husband probably pushed her out of the window. He was, I believe he was arrested at least once, perhaps I think up to 3 times, but he always got off because there was not enough evidence to convict him. Now, she did fall from the 34th floor wearing only her underwear. When they went to interview Carl Andre that night, he had scratches on his face and body, and he said that both of them had been drinking heavily and he couldn't really remember some things. So his story has changed slightly over the years too, which I think leads a lot of people still to suspect him. So he is still alive, he's still working, there are still museums exhibiting his work. And so these days people show up in protest in support of Ana Mendietta. And people don't just do it in the streets, sometimes they actually do it in the galleries too. They drape his work, they stand around it so that people can't even see it. And sometimes they actually, in support of Ana Mendietta, they actually throw chicken blood on the sidewalk, sort of blocking the entrance to galleries that exhibit his work. So to wrap up on this couple and this really sort of scandalous end to their relationship, I have this poster from the Guerrilla Girls, which is an anonymous collective of feminist activist artists. And this is so damning. You know, what do these two men have in common? It's Carl Andre and O.J. Simpson. And so making this connection here about domestic violence and death over here. So we're going to end on a happy note. I started off talking about love and romance and all of this, and here we are talking about death, but we're going to end on a very happy note with the relationship and the works created by Christo and Jean-Claude. Now, prior to this, we've been looking at artists that had sort of their own careers. And what's really interesting about Christo and Jean-Claude is that they had one career, and for a long time, they even just had one name. It was just Christo. So they are a fascinating couple because they were intensely connected with each other sort of from the get-go. They were born in 1935 on the same day. She was born in Morocco and he was born in Bulgaria. She would say, you know, we were born in the same hour, thankfully from different mothers. But they first met in Paris because her mother had hired Christo to paint a portrait. And essentially the second they saw each other, there was a spark. Jean-Claude was already engaged to somebody else. Christo got her pregnant. She still married somebody else, but essentially left him after the honeymoon and was committed to Christo for the rest of her life. For the rest of her life. So he was an artist who was really inspired by one particular work that he saw, and that was this wrapped sewing machine from 1920. This is by the artist Man Ray. He saw this at the Tate, and after he saw this, Jean-Claude described going to Christo's apartment where he had done the same thing essentially with all of his furniture. He becomes almost obsessed with wrapping things. That actually translates to what would happen with a great deal of their artistic collaborations. They would wrap significant buildings and monuments in different cities. This is the wrapped Reichstag. This is the Pont Neuf in Paris. And they had a really sort of interesting process. Oftentimes, Christo would would imagine what the project could be. And then Jean-Claude would kind of project manage everything. She would get the workers in line. She would get the fundraising done. She would get all of the permits. And she said she became an artist out of love for Christo. She said if he'd become a dentist, she would have become a dentist. Now, I should mention that almost all of their projects are temporary, and they only live on really in videos and photographs and sketches. In fact, they raise a lot of the money for these projects through the sketches that they create. One of their first projects was called the Iron Curtain, where they took dozens of these oil barrels and blocked off this tiny narrow street in Paris while he was exhibiting work at a nearby gallery. And so you can imagine just moving all of these things and getting them into place was an undertaking. And Jean-Claude had an important job of diverting the police for several hours so that people could see this and it could be photographed. And their projects would get bigger and bigger over the years. This one is called Valley Curtain, which was this giant sheet of fabric. It was, I think, 150,000 square feet of fabric that was hung in this gap in Rifle, Colorado. And you can see this really striking warm orange color. Well, it was ripped to shreds by wind and rock, but that didn't stop Christo and Jean-Claude from coming back a couple years later and trying it again and getting the kinds of photographs that they wanted from it. My favorite of their projects is this one called Running Fence, which was done in California in Sonoma and Marin counties. It was a 14-foot high curtain that extended for more than 24 miles. And it went, through private property, across roads. You can imagine that the permitting for this, even though it was only up for 2 weeks, was enormous. Getting all the people to help put it up was a massive undertaking. And I love this picture over here because the fence actually terminates into the ocean. But with the photograph on the right, you can see that it essentially looks like this shimmering ribbon that hugs this beautiful landscape and draws your eye through it in this kind of magical way. And with the photograph like this one with the running fence in the background, you get the sense of relief that their project is done, of the wonderful collaboration that these two artists had. And we see that in just a few more works. This was, I believe this is called Surrounded Islands. This was for Biscayne Bay in Miami. This was a project that received maybe a little bit more criticism than most of them because of the color pink in particular. I remember some sort of references to Pepto-Bismol, but their projects tend to be really wonderful, really fanciful. These are just some wrapped trees that they did. But in more recent years, a project that became really well known were the gates in New York City in Central Park, and that they sort of wove through the park for about 23 miles, and they were unveiled in 2005. And it was in the middle of winter, and these gates just added this layer of warmth and vitality to the winter landscape here. It was really fantastic to walk through Central Park and to see these curtains dancing in the breeze here. It was another project that took, I believe, several decades to fundraise for and to get all of the permitting for, and so in the end, you get the sense that just getting these projects built was a particular, it provided this sense of triumph for the two of them. So just to wrap up here, Jean-Claude died at age 74 in 2009 from complications to a brain aneurysm. And she often sort of functioned as a spokesperson for the two of them. And she explained that they were twins and that they had this symbiotic relationship where they spoke with one voice, which is why for many years they just, their name was just Christo, but I think beginning in 1994, they began to name it Christo and Jean-Claude. She said, sometimes we would have the same idea at the same time. And she said they fought almost all the time, continuously, but it got the ideas going. And she also said that 75% of the time, Christo was right. Now, Christo died just 2 years ago in 2020 at the age of 84. And what I think is really kind of amazing is that they had all of these unfinished, unrealized plans. And according to their wills, those plans can still be executed. So somebody else could bring them into fruition. And I think that would be such a wonderful testament to this incredible relationship that these two artists had. So I will wrap up tonight going back to the myth of Pygmalion and falling in love with art and maybe with a fellow studio member. Tonight we've expanded upon the simple premise of just, bringing art to life and falling in love with it. We've looked at how artistic collaboration can lead to competition, collecting. It can fuel love and sometimes perhaps maybe even a little bit of rage, but hopefully we leave sort of inspired by how these relationships produced some really incredible works of art. So I'll end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments anybody has about the artists that we looked at.
There are some questions in chat, Jane.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay, great questions here. Joyce is asking, did Molenaer and Leyster ever paint a painting together? That's a fascinating question. And I would say they almost certainly probably did. That was really part of the process of like sharing a studio with someone. I'm not sure if they did it intentionally to kind of bill it as something that the two of them worked on. And I would say that if they did that, they probably did not share credit with each other. But it's really interesting to think of a potential collaboration there. That's a great question. All right, Sally has asked, what is the name of the man who introduced America to modernism? That would be Alfred Stieglitz. He was the mover and shaker. He was Georgia O'Keeffe's husband. He was the person who was like the great advocate and just knew everybody and helped to really advance a lot of important careers and ideas. And then Karen asked, why did Frida Kahlo paint Diego with a third eye sometimes? It was really because she thought of him as being so wise. It was like the third eye of wisdom, essentially. She had tremendous respect for his intellect, and so she would oftentimes paint him like that. Which is really interesting. And then, in place of where a third eye would be for her, she's painting him. And then what did Christos do with all the fabric afterwards, and who made his fabric, and how much did the installations cost? Diane, these are really good questions. And I don't think I have the specific answers in my notes, but I will say these were massive, massive undertakings. Especially as time went along. I'm not sure what happened to the fabric afterwards. I'm not sure. I almost want to say that they would sell everything that they could in order to help fundraise, but I mean, that would have been after the fact. These are really good questions. I'd have to look them up for you, but thank you for asking them. I'll try and track it down, and I'm giving this presentation again this month, so perhaps I can incorporate some of that in there. And thank you for your kind words. Somebody asked, where's the Claudel Museum? I do have that in my notes. Just a moment, I'll go back to that. I believe it's in a small town. Let's see here. No, I don't have it in my notes. I believe it's in a small town. I almost want to say, sorry, the name of the town escapes me. It's unfortunately, it's not in Paris. It's sort of outside the bustling city, but I get the sense that it's a trip worth taking. And the Frida Kahlo house is that is outside of Mexico City, and that is still there. Diego Rivera had purchased her family's home, and that's where she spent the last few years of her life. It's now a museum, and that is that's definitely on my bucket list to visit someday. Lori, thanks for your kind words. Oh, thank you everybody and the name on the cover. What is the name of this cover painting? I'm assuming, was it this one? What is the name of this cover painting? Well, this would be Rodin's The Kiss up close. Thank you everybody for your kind words and for my and for putting up with my scratchy throat tonight. Yes, Laura, thank you for recommending looking into video of Christo and Jean-Claude, because they were kind of quirky and very charming, and I think seeing their installations through video too, I think gives you a whole new appreciation of their work. So I always love CBS Sunday morning segments on artists, so that would be a great one to look up. Thank you, everybody, for these kind words. This means so much to me. Oh, and Donna, thanks for sharing where the museum was.
And
thank you.
Did you see that the question was clarified? It was the painting that has the artist kissing.
Oh, sorry, that was these are both by this French artist Jérôme. He did a series of them where you're essentially seeing Galatea and Pygmalion in the round. So these are all by Jérôme. And this one's at the Met. I'm not sure offhand where this one is.
Did you want to say something more about the next presentation, Jane?
Well, I think we got a good preview of it tonight. I think especially when you sort of know that some of the driving motivations around why Georgia O'Keeffe went to the Southwest and what her interests were there. I think I think who she was and what she was producing becomes all the more interesting. And you can always go back to these fascinating letters between her and her husband. I think somebody computed all these letters. I want to say there's something like 17,000 pages between the two of them. So there's a lot of rich information that goes into all of this, but we'll look at her beyond the blossoms, which should be fun.
And that sounds great. It's March 3rd, and we are recording this, and there will be a link on the website next week early. And I just want to thank the Friends of the Burlington Public Library, Tewksbury Public Library, and Stevens Memorial Library in Andover for making this art series possible.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much. Hope to see you next month.
Thank you, Jane. Good night.
Bye.